Imagine a shining island empire beyond the edge of the ancient world, concentric rings of marble and metal, canals full of ships, towers glittering in the sun, and then, in a single terrible day and night, earthquakes, giant waves, and silence. Plato called it Atlantis. For over 2,000 years, we've been arguing over whether it was a real place, a moral fable, or something in between. In this episode of Dopamania TV, we're diving deep into the original texts, the wildest location theories, from Greece to the eye of the Sahara, and the real science behind lost worlds. If you love ancient mysteries, hit like early, subscribe, and let's go hunting for Atlantis together. The sky is black and boiling over a restless sea. Lightning flashes, and for a heartbeat you see it, a shining island city rising from the waves. Concentric rings of land and water, harbors packed with ships, straight canals like gleaming mirrors, towers of a strange metal orichalcum, glowing like sunset copper, catch the stormlight. Statues of gods and kings look out over the ocean as if they own it. Music, firelight, markets, temples. A civilization at absolute peak confidence, convinced it will last forever. Then the storm shifts. The water pulls back in a sickening way, as if the ocean itself is taking a breath. A roar builds deeper than thunder. The ground shudders. Walls crack. Temples tilt. In one terrible day and night, the sea rises, the island groans, and the proud city is smashed, drowned, and swallowed whole. When the waves finally settle, there is nothing left on the surface. Just empty horizon and the memory of a world that should not have disappeared. That is the birth scene of the most famous lost civilization in history, Atlantis. Not from a medieval legend, not from a fantasy novel, but from the pages of ancient Greek philosophy. Specifically, from a man you've definitely heard of, Plato. Atlantis begins not as a myth carved on temple walls, but as a story told in his dialogues, where he describes a powerful island empire that challenged ancient Athens and then vanished beneath the sea. In this episode, we're going to pull Atlantis apart piece by piece. We'll separate what Plato actually wrote, the original lines, the numbers, the geography, from more than 2,000 years of speculation, embellishment, and yes, straight-up clickbait. Because while Atlantis might be ancient, the obsession with it is very, very modern. If you've been on YouTube for more than 5 minutes, you've seen it. Thumbnails screaming, "Atlantis found." Red arrows pointing at satellite images. Endless maps of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. One of the most viral examples is the Bright Insight video arguing that the Eye of the Sahara, the Richat structure in Mauritania, is actually the remains of Atlantis. That video alone has pulled in around 3.8 million views, and it's just one node in a massive web of content. Atlantis consistently performs. Documentaries on mainstream platforms, paperback books in airport stores, late-night radio call-ins, and conspiracy channels with names like Ancient Uncovered or Hidden Origins all know that if you put Atlantis in the title, people will click. The idea of a lost super-civilization under the waves is an algorithm's dream. Mystery, visuals, controversy, and just enough history to feel like it might be real. But the story doesn't live only on the internet. It's hardwired into modern pop culture. Disney turned it into a dieselpunk adventure in Atlantis, the Lost Empire, with crystal-powered tech and underwater leviathans. DC's Aquaman built an entire blockbuster around a hidden Atlantean kingdom, with bioluminescent cities and ancient royal bloodlines. Video games from Assassin's Creed Odyssey to Civilization drop Atlantis in as a secret level, a wonder, or a catastrophic plot twist. The History Channel has done so many segments on Atlantis that it's basically a recurring character, often sandwiched between aliens, giants, and doomsday prophecies. So why this story? Of all the old tales we could obsess over, why does a city that might never have existed still dominate our imagination and our feeds? At the core of this episode is a tension that has never really been resolved. On one side, you have the idea that Atlantis might be a distorted memory of something real, maybe an ancient city destroyed by a tsunami, a volcanic eruption, or rising seas. Supporters point to places like the eruption of Thera, the sunken ruins off coasts in the Mediterranean, or legends from other cultures about flood cataclysms, and they ask, could Plato be echoing a very old disaster story that survived through oral tradition? On another side, you have the argument that Atlantis is not history at all, but a coded political allegory. That Plato invented this luxurious, arrogant island empire to make a philosophical point about justice, hubris, and ideal states. In that reading, Atlantis is less like a lost city you can find on a map, and more like a thought experiment, the same way we talk about utopias and dystopias today. And then there is the possibility that Atlantis is pure fantasy, a story that started as a fictional example in a philosophical dialogue, and over centuries we collectively refused to leave it on the page. We turned it into a treasure hunt, layer after layer, until it became a global mystery project that spans archaeologists, fringe theorists, Reddit threads, and backyard researchers scrolling Google Earth at 3 in the morning. Across this video, we're going to walk that tightrope carefully. First, we'll go back to the source and look at what Plato actually said. Not what internet posts paraphrase, but the text itself. The description of the island, its layout, its technology, its timeline, and why he claimed to be telling the story in the first place. Then we'll track how people have hunted for Atlantis across the map. From the obvious candidates in the Mediterranean like Santorini and Crete, to more far-flung proposals in Spain, the Azores, the Caribbean, and the middle of the Atlantic. We'll see how each theory tries to match Plato's details, and where they bend or break the original story. Next, we'll visit some of the wildest and most intriguing proposed locations, including that Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania, which looks uncannily like Plato's description of concentric rings when you see it from space. We'll compare the claims with what geologists and archaeologists actually say about the site. After that, we'll zoom out and talk about the real science of lost cities and ancient cataclysms. Sunken ports, flooded river valleys, entire coastlines swallowed when Ice Age glaciers melted. We'll ask what real evidence a drowned supercivilization would leave behind, and whether we've seen anything that fits. Finally, we'll look at why we can't let this story go. Why a tale written in ancient Greece still hooks our fear of collapse, our hope for hidden knowledge, and our love of solving puzzles together on a global scale. Because whether Atlantis was ever out there, in the ocean, it's definitely alive, in our collective imagination. By the end of this journey, you'll be able to decide for yourself. Was Atlantis ever a real place you could point to on a map, or is it something deeper? A mirror we keep holding up to our own civilizations and their fragility. To answer that, we need to start where the whole thing began, in ancient Greece. In Plato's own words, with a story he claimed came from an old conversation about a very strange island. To understand Atlantis, we have to go back to the only place it really lives in detail, the writings of Plato. Plato was a 4th century BCE Athenian philosopher, a student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle. And he wasn't a historian in the modern sense. He didn't write chronicles of events the way Herodotus or Thucydides did. Instead, he wrote dialogues, dramatic conversations where characters debate big questions about justice, politics, the soul, and the ideal society. So when Plato introduces Atlantis, he does it inside a philosophical story, not in a history textbook or travel report. The legend appears in 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. The setup is deliberately layered. In the story, a character named Critias claims that he heard this tale when he was a boy from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who supposedly heard it in Egypt from priests in the city of Sais. So right away, Plato frames Atlantis as a very old foreign memory, passed through several mouths and several generations. It's like a game of telephone stretching back thousands of years. And he presents it as something that Greek historians somehow missed, but Egyptian temple archives preserved. According to Critias, Solon was told that 9,000 years before his own time, there was a mighty island civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This land, Atlantis, was said to be larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. It sat out in the Atlantic Ocean, facing a true ocean, not just a landlocked sea, and from it you could supposedly reach other islands and even a further continent. So Plato places Atlantis far to the west, beyond the known Mediterranean world of his readers. Inside this vast island realm, there was a famous city with an extraordinary design. Plato describes concentric rings of land and water surrounding a central acropolis, a bullseye pattern of alternating circular canals and causeways, all carefully measured in Greek units called stadia. There are exact figures for the widths of rings, the size of bridges, the length of walls, and the overall scale of the capital, which some modern interpreters have turned into blueprints. At the center stood a holy precinct dedicated to Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, and his human descendants who ruled the island. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was dazzlingly wealthy and technologically advanced by ancient standards. The soil produced abundant crops, the harbors were full of ships, and the people built massive structures faced with metals, including a mysterious material called orichalcum, said to shine like fire and be second only to gold in value. The city had an elaborate system of canals, both around the capital and across a vast rectangular plain that stretched southward from nearby mountains. Plato gives the dimensions of this plain in stadia, describes a grid of irrigation channels, and even mentions a circular canal that linked the city's rings to the open sea. He also adds details that catch the eyes of modern researchers. There were mountains to the north of the plain, high and beautiful, sheltering the land from cold winds. The islands supported a rich variety of animals, including, strikingly, many elephants. That line has triggered all kinds of speculation, because elephants suggest particular climates and regions, and some people have tried to match it with fossil finds or ancient trade in ivory. Politically, Atlantis is pictured as an imperial power. Its kings rule over the island and many other islands and parts of the mainland. Over time, as often happens in Greek moral stories, this fortunate and divinely favored civilization grows corrupt. The Atlanteans become greedy, arrogant, and obsessed with power. They launch aggressive campaigns to dominate the Mediterranean, subduing peoples as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia, until virtuous ancient Athens stands up to resist. In the narrative, Athens, representing Plato's ideal of a just and disciplined city, wins a heroic victory against the Atlantean Empire. Then comes the divine punishment. Because Atlantis has fallen into moral decay, the gods decide to humble it. According to Richat, in a single day and night of misfortune, violent earthquakes and floods strike. The island of Atlantis sinks beneath the sea and disappears, and the waters become impassable, clogged with mud and shoals where a proud empire once stood. That sudden cataclysm is the detail that has launched centuries of geological and archaeological speculation. Scholars notice that Plato doesn't just paint with broad mythic strokes. He piles on specifics, the measurements in stadia, the geometry of the rings, the layout of the plain and canals, the fact that the island opens onto a real geographic point. The pillars of Heracles. These concrete touches make the story feel like a report, and therefore they tempt readers to treat it as hidden history instead of a crafted philosophical myth. But how did ancient readers actually take it? Some appear to have treated it with a wink, as a grand invented story wrapped around serious ideas. Others took it half seriously, wondering if Plato had indeed tapped into some dim memory of a lost age. Most educated Greeks, though, seem to have read it as a moral and political allegory, a way for Plato to contrast a disciplined, idealized Athens with a wealthy, decadent superpower undone by its own hubris. Importantly, no major Greek historian writing around Plato's time independently confirms Atlantis. Herodotus, who loved travel stories and exotic lands, never mentions it. Thucydides, who carefully reconstructed the Peloponnesian War, is silent. Later writers like Strabo and Plutarch do talk about Atlantis, but they're clearly responding to Plato's story, not unveiling new sources or independent evidence. So modern scholars are left debating a crucial question. Was Plato dressing up a kernel of real events, like Bronze Age volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and sudden collapses of coastal cities, in the costume of a philosophical fable? Or did he freely invent Atlantis as a kind of thought experiment? A warning about what happens when a powerful state abandons virtue for luxury and domination. If the story is pure invention, then the hunt for a physical Atlantis is misguided. But if there is even a sliver of reality behind it, then we're left with a tantalizing puzzle. If Atlantis was ever based on something real, where on earth could it have been? And why have so many people, across centuries, tried to put this vanished island on a map? Now that we've unpacked Plato's story, let's turn it into a kind of geographic treasure hunt. Instead of jumping straight to wild locations around the globe, we'll start close to home, in the world the Greeks actually knew. Many researchers argue that if Atlantis has any historical core at all, it probably sits somewhere around the Mediterranean or the nearby Atlantic coast. Why there? Because Plato gives anchors that point to the familiar ancient world. He mentions the Pillars of Heracles, which most classical writers associate with the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. He describes known trade routes, talks about rivalries with early Athens, and paints a culture that sounds like a very advanced Bronze Age maritime power. If you start from those clues and you don't want to invoke lost continents, you inevitably end up scanning the eastern Atlantic seaboard and the Mediterranean basin. The most famous candidate is Santorini, or ancient Thera, and the broader Minoan world on Crete. Picture the Minoans at their height, around the 2nd millennium BCE. A wealthy island civilization with palaces like Knossos, sprawling multi-story complexes, storerooms packed with jars of oil and wine, colorful frescoes showing fleets of ships, acrobats leaping over bulls, and a society deeply tied to the sea. They traded across the Aegean and beyond, moving metals, luxury goods, and ideas. To later Greeks, the Minoans already felt half-mythical, inspiring stories like King Minos, the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur. Now drop a volcano into this picture. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera exploded in one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. The eruption blew out the center of the island, created the caldera we see today, launched ash high into the atmosphere, and likely triggered tsunamis across the Aegean. Settlements on Thera were buried in ash, and the wider Minoan world seems to have taken a serious hit. It wasn't an instant, civilization-ending knockout, but it was a shock big enough to echo through memory. You can see why many people say, this looks a lot like Atlantis, an advanced seafaring island culture linked to Crete, devastated by earthquakes, volcanic fire, and flood. It's tempting to imagine that, over centuries of retelling, the disaster at Thera and the decline of Minoan power became the seed for Plato's story of a brilliant island world swallowed by the sea. However, the fit isn't perfect. Plato dates Atlantis to 9,000 years before Solon, which lands you around 9600 BCE, not 1600 BCE. Defenders of the Minoan theory usually argue that a scribe miscopied hundreds as thousands, or that Plato deliberately stretched the numbers to make the story feel more distant and grand. There's also the geography problem. Plato puts Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in the Atlantic, while Thera and Crete sit firmly inside the Aegean. Some try to solve this by suggesting that in earlier Greek usage, Pillars of Heracles might have referred to different straits within Greek waters, but that's debated. And then there's city layout. Plato's concentric rings of land and water don't match any Minoan site we've uncovered so far. Other researchers loosen the net a bit and look across the whole Aegean. In these versions, Plato is not describing a single, literal city, but compressing memories of many islands, coastal centers, and disasters into one composite supercivilization. The Pillars of Heracles might be reinterpreted as a local landmark, or as a poetic device rather than a strict map reference. Along Greek coasts and on submerged shelves, divers and sonar surveys have found walls, foundations, and pavements under the water. These finds sometimes get headlines as "sunken cities of Atlantis." But when archaeologists examine them carefully, most turn out to be typical coastal settlements drowned by normal sea level rise, harbor works damaged by earthquakes, or even natural rock formations that just happen to look regular to the human eye. Intriguing, yes, but nothing that cleanly matches Plato's detailed engineering fantasy. If we follow Plato's Beyond the Pillars more literally, our search shifts to southern Spain and the Strait of Gibraltar. Here, the coastline has changed dramatically since antiquity, and there are wide, low-lying plains where ancient estuaries and marshlands have been reshaped by the sea. One of the most publicized hotspots is near Doñana National Park, on the Atlantic side of Spain. Satellite images and ground surveys have suggested circular or rectangular structures buried beneath sediments, leading some to argue for a Bronze Age port city that was later hit by floods or tsunamis. In the nearby Gulf of Cadiz, underwater surveys have found remains of harbors and settlements, proof that this was an active trade corridor. This ties into another historical puzzle, Tartessos. Classical writers describe Tartessos, somewhere in southwestern Iberia, as a wealthy, metal-rich culture trading silver, copper, and possibly tin. Archaeological sites in this region show elaborate metalworking, complex social elites, and links to Phoenician traders. To some, Tartessos looks like a real, powerful Atlantic-facing kingdom that could have inspired Plato's story of a rich Western empire challenging the older Mediterranean powers. But again, there are gaps. No one has uncovered a monumental city built in perfect concentric rings of land and canals, as Plato describes. There's no clear, single catastrophe layer that shows a flourishing Atlantic superpower suddenly wiped out by one overnight deluge. The evidence points to multiple coastal communities, developing and declining over centuries, in a landscape constantly reshaped by rivers and the sea. Further east, other islands get pulled into the debate. Sardinia, for instance, is home to the Nuragic culture, known for its thousands of megalithic stone towers, called nurag, scattered across the island. These mysterious structures, some clustered into complex fortified sites, hint at a sophisticated Bronze and Iron Age society with strong architectural traditions and control over land and resources. A few researchers argue that Sardinia was the real Atlantis, with offshore rock features and rumored submerged structures recast as drowned portions of a once more expansive island. Malta and Cyprus also get their turn in the spotlight. Malta has ancient megalithic temples and a deep maritime history. Cyprus has rich Bronze Age cities linked to copper production and Eastern Mediterranean trade. In each case, people point to advanced island cultures, strategic positions, and possible earthquake or tsunami damage as ingredients that could have been stirred into Plato's narrative. What all these Mediterranean theories share is an attempt to keep at least one foot on solid ground. They look at real Bronze Age and Iron Age civilizations, real volcanic eruptions, real tsunamis, and try to reconcile them with Plato by tweaking the numbers, the translations, or the geography just enough to make things line up. Sometimes that means shrinking Plato's 9,000 years to 900. Sometimes it means moving the Pillars of Heracles on the map, or treating his city plan as symbolic rather than literal. These approaches stay relatively close to mainstream archaeology, even if many scholars still think the connections are stretched. But in recent years, a newer, flashier idea has grabbed attention by doing something very different. It takes Atlantis far from the familiar coasts and drops it deep inland, into the deserts of Mauritania. In the next section, we'll head across the Sahara to explore the strange, circular Eye of Africa, and ask whether this natural wonder could really hide the footprint of Plato's lost city. From way out in orbit, in the middle of endless tan and gold desert, there's this one feature that looks so strange it almost feels artificial. Astronauts call it the Eye of the Sahara. On satellite images, it's like a giant bullseye burned into North Africa, a huge, almost perfectly circular formation, roughly 40 to 50 kilometers across, built of concentric rings of rock and shallow basins. No mountains, no coastline, just this hypnotic target stamped into the heart of Mauritania's desert, visible from space and impossible to unsee once you know it's there. This is the Richat structure, and on YouTube it's become the superstar of modern Atlantis speculation. If there is a hottest, trendiest candidate for Atlantis right now, this is it. Type Eye of the Sahara Atlantis into the search bar, and you'll fall into a rabbit hole of explainers, reaction videos, and Google Earth tour, zooming in and out of this one spot like it's the final boss of ancient mystery. Geologists, though, will tell you a very different story from the paranormal thumbnails. To them, the Richat isn't some colossal ruined city. It's a deeply eroded geological dome. Think of it like a blister in the Earth's crust that rose up over millions of years, then had its layers worn away by wind and water. The different rock layers erode at different speeds, so the toughest layers stand out as circular ridges, and the softer ones sink into shallower depressions. Over absurdly long timescales, that process naturally carves those striking concentric rings. No alien builders, no ancient engineers, just plate tectonics, uplift, and erosion doing their thing. So why are Atlantis hunters absolutely obsessed with it? A big part of it is that visually, it matches one core image from Plato almost too well. Plato describes Atlantis's capital as a series of alternating rings of land and water, like a target. Ring of land, ring of water, ring of land, and so on, with a central island in the middle. When people look at the Richat structure from above, they see those circular bands of elevated rock and lowered basins and think, there it is, that's the blueprint. Supporters go further. They point out that if you take Plato's measurements for the Atlantis city and convert his units into modern kilometers, the diameter you get is in the general ballpark of the Richat's inner rings. Not a perfect match, but close enough for the imagination to snap into place. Then there's the environment. Today the Richat sits in brutal desert, but paleoclimate evidence shows the Sahara wasn't always like this. There were periods when it was much greener, crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes and wetlands. Satellite imagery and fieldwork suggest ancient river channels and watercourses around the region, so believers argue that in the distant past this area could have been a lush, habitable zone instead of a sandy wasteland. The idea exploded in visibility when the YouTube channel Bright Insight released a viral video arguing that the Richat structure might actually be the site of Atlantis. That video has pulled in around 3.8 million views and essentially launched an entire microgenre. After it blew up, you started seeing spin-offs everywhere. People screen recording their own Google Earth expeditions across the Sahara, 3D reconstructions of what Atlantis would look like superimposed onto the Richat. Response videos saying this changes everything or here, that's what everyone missed. It became a collaborative online treasure hunt. Fans comb through high-resolution satellite images and freeze-frame what they claim are harbor remains, straight-line walls, or grid-like roads radiating from the rings. Others speculate about cataclysmic flooding events when the climate of the Sahara shifted, imagining torrents of water tearing through a once thriving coastal or riverine city and burying it beneath layers of sediment. There are also reports and videos highlighting stone tools and signs of very ancient human habitation around the region, presented as breadcrumbs pointing to an advanced lost civilization that just might fit Plato's timeline. Now let's put on the skeptic's hat for a moment, because the scientific response is almost the mirror image of that story. Geologists emphasize, over and over, that the Richat's features are entirely consistent with natural processes. The circular pattern, that's what you'd expect from an uplifted dome where rock layers are arranged like an onion and then sliced horizontally by erosion. The apparent walls and roads, when you zoom in, those usually resolve into normal fracture lines, drainage patterns, vehicle tracks, or even pareidolia, our tendency to see shapes and structures where none were designed. Then there's the location issue. Plato is extremely clear that Atlantis was an island in front of the Strait of Gibraltar, out in the Atlantic Ocean. The Richat structure is landlocked, hundreds of kilometers from the Atlantic coast, with no ancient shoreline that would turn it into a true island city encircled by sea. You can argue metaphors and mistranslations, but this is a big mismatch between the source and the site. Archaeologists add another layer of caution. Yes, the wider Sahara shows evidence of prehistoric human activity, stone tools, campsites, rock art, and traces of people adapting to changing climate over many thousands of years. But there is nothing in or around the Richat that looks like a massive Bronze Age supercity. No clear remains of large-scale metalworking, no monumental stone architecture, no organized street plans or harbors big enough to support Plato's naval empire. For the scientific community, you don't need Atlantis to explain what we see. Erosion patterns, rock types, uplift, and climate shifts already do the job. And this brings us to a broader pattern that goes far beyond one circle in the desert. Visually striking features like the Richat structure act like magnets for myths. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. When we see a perfect circle in nature, we instinctively ask, who built that? In the age of Google Earth, that instinct gets supercharged. Anyone with a laptop can scan the planet for anomalies, pause on something weird, and spin an entire narrative around it. Add in the storytelling power of this is what they don't want you to know, and you've got a perfect recipe for viral mystery. The emotional pull is real. The Richat theory feels satisfying because it pins the Atlantis legend to a specific, spectacular address. Instead of a vague, somewhere out there, you can drop a pin on the map, zoom in, and imagine walking the ringed streets of a forgotten metropolis. Even if the science says natural dome, the image says ancient city, and that clash is exactly where fascination lives. So where does that leave us? Even if the Eye of the Sahara and a lot of other popular candidates aren't literally Atlantis, there's still a deeper question worth asking. Could memories of real ancient disasters have fueled Plato's tale? Tsunamis swallowing coastlines, floods wiping out settlements, trade hubs collapsing overnight, events dramatic enough to echo for generations. In the next part, we'll dive into actual lost cities and real cataclysms, and explore how those very real ruins might have inspired the most famous sunken city of all. Now, before we go any deeper into the mystery of Atlantis itself, it helps to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because the ancient world was full of places that actually did disappear, stories that sounded like fantasy, but turned out to be rooted in real, physical cities buried under mud, jungle, and ocean. Take Troy. For a long time in Western scholarship, the city in Homer's Iliad was treated as pure myth, a kind of Bronze Age Hollywood set for gods and heroes. There was no agreed map coordinate for Troy, no surviving city walls you could visit, and many experts assumed it was just a poetic invention. Then, in the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann went digging in what is now northwestern Turkey. He was eccentric, overconfident, and he made some huge archaeological mistakes, but he also uncovered layers of a real city at Hisarlik, fortifications, houses, and evidence of destruction. It wasn't a smoking gun for every detail in Homer's story, yet it showed that a place once dismissed as legend had a concrete footprint. The same pattern repeats elsewhere. For centuries, European travelers heard rumors of great Maya cities swallowed by the jungle, with pyramids and causeways hidden under vines and trees. Many dismissed those tales as exaggerations. Then explorers and archaeologists started documenting sites like Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul, and now LiDAR scanning from the air reveals entire urban networks, roads, and platforms under the forest canopy. Suddenly, what sounded like fable becomes something you can see in satellite images and walk through stone by stone. Or think about Angkor in Cambodia. At its peak under the Khmer Empire, Angkor was a sprawling metropolis with sophisticated reservoirs and canals. After it declined, much of the city was overtaken by the forest. Local people still knew the temples, but to outsiders it became a half-mythic, lost city swallowed by nature, until modern archaeology mapped it and showed that it was once one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth. Even under the sea, we're finding echoes of these stories. Off the coast of Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile, lies Heracleion, also known as Thonis. Ancient texts described a bustling port where traders, priests, and sailors passed through on their way to the Nile. For a long time, no one knew where it was. Many thought those references might be confused or symbolic. Then, in the early 2000s, divers and underwater archaeologists located the city's remains on the seafloor. Colossal statues toppled in the mud, temple ruins, docks, and shipwrecks preserved in the silt. A literally submerged city that had survived in writing long after it vanished from view. So the pattern is clear. Sometimes, legends preserve a distorted memory of something real. That doesn't mean every myth hides a single exact city waiting to be found, but it does mean we should take the broader context seriously. The ancient world was dynamic, fragile, and constantly reshaped by water and stone. This is where geology changes the conversation. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, global sea levels rose by around 120 meters. That is an astonishing amount of water. Huge coastal plains that once housed animals and people were gradually drowned. If you wanted beachfront property in the Paleolithic, your house is now under the waves. One of the clearest examples is Doggerland, the now submerged land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Today, it lies beneath the North Sea. But during the Ice Age and for some time after, it was a landscape of rivers, marshes, forests, and, importantly, human communities. Fishermen and energy companies occasionally pull mammoth bones, stone tools, and even traces of ancient peat layers from the seafloor. This was not an abstract, lost world. It was a place where people hunted, gathered, and told stories until rising seas slowly erased it from the map. Imagine generations watching the coastline creep inland, marshes turning into open water, storms tearing away at low-lying settlements. You can see how, over time, those experiences could become myths of great floods, angry gods, or drowned lands beyond the horizon. And when we look at global mythology, flood stories are everywhere. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh includes a dramatic deluge narrative involving Utnapishtim, who survives a world-engulfing flood in a boat filled with life. The Hebrew Bible story of Noah echoes many of the same themes, a divine warning, A constructed ark, the preservation of animals, a reset for humanity. Across the world, indigenous traditions, from the Pacific Northwest to Australia to South America, tell of waters rising, canoes or rafts carrying survivors, and landscapes being remade. These aren't all copies of one original story. They're local responses to very real experiences of flooding, storms, and shifting shorelines. Now, when we circle back to Atlantis, we can start to see possible real-world ingredients behind Plato's dramatic narrative. One candidate we mentioned earlier is the eruption of Thera, or Santorini. Around the 16th century BCE, this was a colossal volcanic event in the Aegean Sea that devastated nearby islands and likely dealt a heavy blow to the Minoan civilization. The eruption would have produced ash clouds, tsunamis, and sudden destruction on a terrifying scale. People living in the region would absolutely have remembered it. The Mediterranean is also prone to tsunamis generated by earthquakes and underwater landslides. These waves can arrive with little warning, smash harbors, and rip buildings from their foundations. One especially striking historical case is the city of Helike in Greece. In 373 BCE, Helike was a prosperous city on the Corinthian Gulf. Ancient sources describe an earthquake, followed by a massive wave that swallowed the city. By the next day, Helike had disappeared beneath the sea and mud, with only the tops of buildings or trees sometimes reported sticking out of the water. For centuries afterward, fishermen supposedly saw ruins beneath the waves. Helike became a cautionary tale in antiquity, a real-world example of a city obliterated overnight. Then, in the late 20th century, modern archaeologists finally located its remains buried under sediment, slightly inland, showing that parts of the city had sunk and been covered by earthquake deposits and marine incursions. In other words, Plato and his audience lived in a world where a city swallowed by the sea was not just metaphor, it had happened in living memory. So if you combine memories of disasters like Thera, recurring tsunamis, the very real loss of places like Helike, plus older memories of rising seas after the Ice Age, you get a rich raw material for a story like Atlantis. But stories don't travel through time unchanged. Oral traditions compress, stretch, and exaggerate. A flood that devastated a coastline might, over centuries, become a tale of an entire empire disappearing. Numbers are especially slippery. In translation from Egyptian to Greek, in scribal copying, or in rhetorical storytelling, 900 years can easily become 9,000. Distances can expand. A regional maritime power becomes a globe-spanning super-civilization. When we test Plato's description of a highly advanced, metal-using, globally connected empire supposedly existing 9,000 years before Solon against what we know from archaeology and genetics, the pieces don't fit. We see no consistent layers of advanced metallurgy, no global trade networks, no anomalous architecture scattered across continents that would reveal a Bronze Age, plus society at 11 or 12,000 BCE. Human groups were sophisticated in their own ways, but they were still hunter-gatherers or early experimenters with plants and animals, not running bronze foundries and palace bureaucracies. If such a vast civilization had really dominated the ancient world at that time, we'd expect to find its traces everywhere. Distinctive tools, shared styles of art, unusual burial customs, and genetic signatures showing large-scale migrations or mixing. Instead, we see a patchwork of smaller cultures adapting to local environments. Therefore, the most plausible explanation is that Atlantis is not a documentary report, but a myth that stitches together real phenomena: post-ice age flooding, catastrophic eruptions, sudden earthquakes, and drowned ports, into one dramatic narrative about hubris, technology, and downfall. Plato used that narrative for philosophical purposes, but the ingredients he chose feel powerful because they're anchored in things humans really lived through. So instead of asking only, was Atlantis real, we can start asking a deeper question. Why does a story like this matter to us so much that we keep retelling it, reshaping it, and searching for it on maps and ocean floors? That's where we're heading next. If you zoom out for a moment, the most interesting thing about Atlantis isn't where it was. It's what we've turned it into over the last 2,000 years. After the fall of Rome, Plato's story mostly went quiet in Europe, tucked away in manuscripts that very few people could read. Then, during the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the Greek texts, and suddenly Atlantis was back on the table. Humanists and early scientists took Plato seriously. But they also loved grand harmonies and hidden histories. So they started wondering if Atlantis might connect to the strange new lands across the ocean that Columbus had just bumped into. By the 16th and 17th centuries, you had thinkers proposing that the Americas were actually the remains of Atlantis, or that the people living there descended from Atlanteans. Francis Bacon wrote The New Atlantis, not as a map, but as a blueprint for an ideal scientific society, an island of researchers, libraries, and laboratories. Atlantis here was a thought experiment about what knowledge could do for humanity. Then the 19th century turned the volume way up. As archaeology, geology, and evolutionary theory exploded, so did anxiety and excitement about deep time and lost civilizations. In this environment, occult movements like theosophy grabbed Atlantis with both hands. Helena Blavatsky and later writers described Atlantis as home of a spiritually advanced root race, gifted with psychic powers and subtle energies. Suddenly, Atlantis wasn't just an island. It was the missing chapter of human evolution, a mystical golden age destroyed by misuse of power. Pseudo-archaeology grew around that idea. Some authors claimed that Atlanteans had airships, death rays, and global crystal networks thousands of years before recorded history. And because myths can be twisted, early 20th century racists and Nazis tried to hijack Atlantis too. In their hands, it became evidence for imaginary superior bloodlines and secret Aryan homelands. Expeditions went to Tibet, the Arctic, and the Atlantic, searching for traces of mythic ancestors that matched their ideology, not reality. In each era, Atlantis became a mirror, reflecting whatever that culture feared or desired most. Fast forward to today, and Atlantis is everywhere. Disney turned it into a dieselpunk adventure in Atlantis, the Lost Empire, complete with flying fish ships, glowing crystals, and a hidden civilization under the waves. DC Comics made Atlantis the underwater kingdom of Aquaman, with bioorganic technology, politics, and war. The Assassin's Creed video games fold Atlantis into their lore as part of the Isu, an ancient precursor race whose ruins and artifacts quietly shape human history behind the scenes. Turn on late-night TV, and you'll find a dozen documentaries asking if Atlantis was really in Santorini or Cuba or Antarctica. Scroll TikTok or YouTube, and the legend collides with almost every modern conspiracy. Atlantis as an ancient alien base, Atlantis under the ice. Atlantis suppressed by shadowy governments who don't want you to know the truth. New Age communities talk about Atlantean crystals humming with energy, or people who believe they're reincarnated Atlantean priests sent back to heal the planet. In all of these versions, Atlantis acts like shorthand. It stands for lost technology just out of reach, hidden libraries full of forbidden knowledge, and a utopia that destroyed itself. It's both promise and warning. Look at what we could become, and look at how badly we could mess it up. Underneath, there's a powerful psychological appeal. Atlantis whispers that the world still hides enormous secrets, that even in the age of satellite maps and deep-sea scanners, we haven't fully charted our own past. That idea is intoxicating in a world that can sometimes feel over-explained and boring. And if you're one of the people who think you've figured out the real story, that makes you part of a small, enlightened group who see what others can't. That same mindset fuels a lot of other fringe ideas. Pyramids built by aliens, civilizations under Antarctica, secret tunnels under every landmark. It's the thrill of being in on something big, the sense that history class left out the good parts. But there's also a healthier side to this fascination. For some people, that first Lost Civilization documentary is the gateway drug that leads to real archaeology and geology. They start by searching for Atlantis and end up learning how radiocarbon dating works, how plate tectonics shapes continents, and how myths migrate from culture to culture. Atlantis, in that sense, is a spark. It gives permission to ask weird questions, to imagine, to dig deeper. So we end up with a tension, skepticism on one side, wonder on the other. It's easy to fall into extremes, either believing every dramatic claim with no evidence, or rolling your eyes so hard that curiosity dies. The sweet spot is in between. We can enjoy the mystery and still ask hard questions. That means evaluating sources, checking whether a claim appears in peer-reviewed research or only on a monetized clickbait channel, and remembering how easy it is to misread satellite images, sonar glitches, or oddly shaped rocks on the seafloor. It means noticing when a theory quietly ignores mountains of data, or when it leans on stereotypes about primitive, ancient people who supposedly couldn't build anything impressive on their own. At the same time, we shouldn't be afraid of the question, what if? Hypotheticals are how science starts. Legends like Atlantis can be creative launchpads, as long as we're honest about where evidence ends and imagination begins. You can say, Plato probably invented this city as an allegory, and still find value in the story. So maybe the real question is, did Atlantis exist exactly the way Plato described? But what does our obsession with it say about us? Why do we keep returning to this drowned city when we already have real lost worlds to explore? Sunken Bronze Age ports, forgotten cities in the Amazon, ruined trade hubs in the Sahara. As we move into our closing, think back over the journey. From Plato's dialogues to Renaissance dreamers to mystics and Nazis to Disney, Aquaman, video games, TikTok conspiracies, and finally to places like Mauritania's Eye of the Sahara. Whether you see Atlantis as pure myth, distorted memory, or something in between, it clearly still matters. So I want to hear from you. What's your take? Is Atlantis just a story, a symbol, or a puzzle that still hasn't been fully solved? And what does your favorite theory reveal, not just about the past, but about the kind of future you hope we're heading toward? We've journeyed from Plato's dimly lit symposiums to the storm-torn Aegean, from Spanish marshlands to the Eye of the Sahara, and into the very real world of lost cities and ancient cataclysms. Whether you now see Atlantis as a misunderstood memory of disasters, a brilliant philosophical parable, or simply the greatest legend we've ever told ourselves, one thing is clear: its power over our imagination is very real. Now I want to hear from you. Which theory makes the most sense, or the best story to you? Do you think the Richat structure could be Atlantis, or is it all clever pattern matching? Drop your thoughts and favorite theories in the comments. If this deep dive sparked new questions, hit like, share it with a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe to Dopamania TV for more long-form explorations of the world's strangest legends. Our next lost world might be just one clue away.